Right, it's time to start today's lecture. And as see today, we have public key encryption and message authentication on the agenda. So we'll continue from yesterday's. Let's see. If I could just switch as well. There's always something. Well, that didn't work either. Well, I guess we have to live with this then, since it doesn't work to. Okay, so we'll talk about hash functions first, which will be later used mainly for authentication of different types. And then we'll go into talk about the public key encryption, first principles, the basic ideas, and then some algorithms. And then we'll tie them together, hash algorithms and public encryption. And we'll also talk about digital signatures at the end that also uses both of these. So we'll start with hash functions then. And this is the idea where to have a hash functions. We have some type of domain here containing messages. That domain can be of any size. We have messages of any size in this domain. So it's just, well, it could be Word messages or Word documents, whatever. It doesn't matter. They can be of any size. And then we have some type of mapping here from this domain into what we call a message digest domain or hash value domain. So we have mappings here. So a certain point here in this domain is mapped to another point in this domain. So here we have bit strings of any length, and we map them to bit strings of a fixed length, n bits. And these n bits are generally relatively small. I mean, in the first domain, we can have millions or billions of bits in the strings. In the second domain here, we talk about maybe 512 bits, something like that. It's typical. So what we do is we make a compression. We compress a large message into a message digest. So it's and sometimes we call it a lossy compression function. And why is it lossy? Well, normal compression functions like zip, we do the same thing. We take a large message, we compress it, that makes we turn it into a new domain. But then it's a reverse function where it can take us back. We can decompress it and get the message back. But with a lossy compression function, we don't have an reverse function. We couldn't get it back. So that's why it's lossy. We lose information. As you see, we have this concept of collisions. We do have collisions between different points. So as you see here, we have 2 points, x and x prime, both are mapped to this y here. So in this case, we have a collision. 2 very different messages. When we compress them together, we get a result that is identical. That is called a collision. The idea with a hash function, well, we have different properties of it. And one of them is that it should look random. So each bit almost equally likely to be 0 or 1. So whatever message we take in the left domain, when we apply the hash function to it, we should get the result that is a random number of zeros and bits. It doesn't matter if the message to the left is just zeros or just ones, whatever. The hash result should be random. We shouldn't be able to find any correlation between the message and the digest. There are different types of hash functions. There are simple hash functions and there are what we call cryptographic hash functions. And they have special properties then. So you start with a simple hash function. This is an example of a very simple hash function. We take a message, we put it into a matrix like this. We start with row 1, take the first bit of a message, fill the first row until column n. What n is, we decide. And then we continue the next row, just fill that one, and then we continue, just add rows until we have the entire message in these m blocks here, m rows. Okay, so now we have a message. What we do now is that we compute bitwise XOR on the columns here. So starting with the first column, we take the first 2 rows, we XOR that. The result of that is forwarded to the third row, we XOR the result with that, we take it to the next row, and then we just continue. So if we make an example, we have very simple. We have a message here which is this is our message. And now we perform XOR then. So we start with the first 2 rows. 0 XOR 1 is what? 1, yeah? So we have 1, and then we XOR 1 with 1, 0, 0 XOR 0, 0, 0 XOR 0 is 0 again. So the first bit is 0. Then 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So that would be our hash digest then. Okay, so this is very simple, of course, to compute. It has the properties that we talked about. We can have a message of any length, and we compute a digest with a fixed length, n bits. We can make it a little bit more better, as you see here, by introducing shifts. So once we have XOR 2 rows, we shift the value 1 row, one step to the right, or actually we should use rotate then. So we rotate the bit that goes out, we should rotate into the left, and then we XOR with next row, circulate, and then and so on. That would improve, make it more random. But it's not considered to be a secure hash function. So let's look at what is needed for it to be considered to be secure. Well, there are a number of properties. The first property is that the hash function can be applied to a block of any size. So that's fine. Our simple function lives up to that. Secondly, we say it should produce a fixed length output. Okay, still fine. Third one, it should be easy to compute this hash value for any given value x. So yeah, again, it's fine. We can easily compute it. But now it starts to get a little bit more tricky. Now we say that for any given code h, it is computationally infeasible to find x such as h of x is this small h. Infeasible means that it's in principle impossible. It's not impossible because we have collisions. We always have collisions, but it should be almost impossible to find those collisions. That's what we say here. It should require more work than at some level when we decide. So computationally infeasible, in principle impossible to find. So what we're saying here is that, okay, we have a hash value, h, a digest. We couldn't find a certain message that will give that. So we couldn't make this reverse. We couldn't find a message that will give that. For our simple XOR here, say that we would like to, instead of having this 0, 1, 1, we would like to have 0, 0, 0 here. So the question is, can we find a message that will give us that hash value, that digest? If we can easily find any message that gives that, then we have broken this fourth requirement. Can we find a message that will give us digest 0, 0, 0?
If there's an even number of ones in each row.
Exactly. So say that we have this, for instance, this message. That will give us the digest 0, 0, 0. And there are lots of messages that will give us, so we can easily find many. So, okay, obviously our simple function doesn't live up with this requirement, but that's not enough. We have more, as you see. So number 5, for any given block x, again, it's computationally infeasible to find another value, y, with the same hash value. So we shouldn't be able to find two different messages that will give us the same digest. If we have a certain x, we shouldn't be able to find another one with the same digest. And the last one is even harder, because now we say that we couldn't find any pair of messages that give the same digest. If we can choose whatever we want, we still couldn't find two messages that will collide. We know they exist, but we couldn't easily find them. So, but these are the requirements, and it is possible to meet them. There are a number of hash algorithms that meet them, more or less, because we say computation infeasible. Infeasible means that it's not impossible, so it's always up to a certain level, of course. We have a family of algorithms that's called this SHA, Secure Hash Algorithm. See, it started to be designed in the 90s, and it has been revised several times, and they have added more different versions of it over time. It's an algorithm that is the standard algorithm to be used with a standard called DSA, Digital Signature Algorithm. So whenever we want to make a digital signature using that standard, we have to use this as a SHA. It's based on an older hash, which is called MD4, another function or algorithm. So hash algorithms existed earlier. It's actually relatively old with simple hash algorithms, but secure hash algorithms are not that old. If you look at this SHA, it produces 160-bit hash, so that's the size of a digest that we create. It was used for a number of years, but as you see in 2005, there were some concerns about it, that it could actually be broken. We could find collisions within a limited time that we had. So then they decided, well, we need to improve the algorithm. So they added, as I said before, additional versions of it. And the major part of it is actually extending the size of a digest. So the name of them says that. SHA 256 means that the digest is now 256 bits instead. And 512, then it's 512. The security of an hash algorithm is very much related to the size of a digest. In the same way as encryption algorithms is very reliant on the size of a key. The longer the key we have for an encryption algorithm, the more secure it is, the harder it will be to brute force. The same principle goes for hash algorithm. The longer the digest is, the harder it will be to brute force attack the algorithm and find collisions. So just increasing is a good way to make it more secure. The question is if it will be secure enough. All of these in this family so far are based on the same principle on how to calculate the digest. So they are similar in terms of how we could possibly attack them. So here we have all the different versions up until this 512 then. If you look at them, we see that they have some properties. Well, they have a message digest size, of course. That's the main part. But if you look at other properties, we have a message size. And here we actually break one of the requirements, because we say that the message cannot be larger than a certain maximum. The reason for that is that we also include the size of a message into the hash calculations. And we have a limited number of bits allocated for that. And that puts an upper limit on how long the message can be. It's not a huge problem, because they are quite big. And if we have bigger messages, we can just split them in two and create a digest for each of them. So it's not a big concern, but it's, in principle, it's a violation against the rules. We can also see we talk about block sizes and word sizes. And again, it's similar to encryption algorithm. We always process a text in blocks. And that's the block size here. So you see the block size is a little bit different. And again, the same principle as for encryption algorithms. The larger block size, the more secure it will be, but it will also require more work, of course. We also talk about number of steps. So again, in encryption algorithms, we typically have a number of rounds. We work with the input text in a number of rounds. Here we do a similar thing. We do it in steps. Each step is typically simpler than the steps in an encryption algorithm, but on the other hand, as you see, we have typically more steps. We process the text even more. So if we go into one, we can see this is an example of the SH8512 Up at the top we have a message, L bits long. At the end we have a number of bits here allocated for the size. And then at the, oh sorry, that's the last bit, well, the last one on 28 bits. Then we have a field here that is called padding. And that is needed because if we have a message that this is a message that we would like to create hash code for, we divide it into the blocks that we work with. And then we see that, okay, once we have divided into blocks, we have a small rest part here. And when we now put it into this SHA, okay, so this is the message. Now we have to put it into this buffer that we have. So we put, of course, the blocks first. And then we have a small part here. And at the end we have the size. But all blocks have to be 1024 bits, including this one. And the message part is just too small, which means that we have to add what is called padding here. So we just extend the length of a message with this bit pattern, as you see, 100000. And to know where the padding starts, where the boundary here, that is why we need the size. So we need exactly where the padding starts. So okay, now we have that. That means now we have a number of blocks that are all 1024 bits long. And now we can start processing it. We take the first block into this F, some type of function that do some computations on the block. The XOR the result of that with, again, as we saw yesterday, an initialization vector, a predefined value, so we have something to start with, to give us the first intermediate value h1, and then exactly as in the chaining mode that we also saw yesterday, we now start to link them. So we take that first block, link it to the computation of the second block, and then so at the end, this last block here is a computation that is based on all the blocks, of course. And that block is now 512 bits long, exactly as the size of all the intermediate blocks that we have here. Okay. I see that the sound is not very good for the distance student. Is it? It looks okay from the recording. Can you hear me now? Okay, let's hope it keeps good. What goes on in this F? Well, in F we have something called the Merkel-Damgaard construction. And these are Danish researchers who came up with the math on how to make the computations here in F. As you see, it consists of 80 rounds. So we are inputting the previous round or the previous processing of the previous 1024 bits together with the current, and then we update. For 80 rounds we do different type of computations. We merge them, we XOR, we swap around bits and so on. Similar to what we've seen in encryption algorithms, but these are generally easier, smaller, simpler, faster operations. Now, all of them in the SHA family are built in a similar way. It's just that we have increased the size of the blocks and the size of the digest that is created, but the computations are very similar. Now, let's look at this property that we start talking about, saying that a hash function is one way, meaning that we couldn't, once we have created a hash digest, we couldn't find what message it was that created it. So it should be hard to invert, or it should be impossible really. And that is called sometimes the pre-image resistance, that we shouldn't be able to know the image that was used to create a certain hash value. But a question here is, how hard is it to find any of the messages that created it? Because there are a number of messages that could have created it. So how hard is it to find one of those? And how hard is it to find two of them? Well, To do that, we can always rely on brute forcing. Brute forcing a hash function would mean that we test a message to see what hash digest it would give. And then we create another random message, and then we just continue to create random messages and compute to see what we get until we have a collision. So now we have found a collision. So the question is, how long time will it take for us to find that collision? If we just start with a value and try to find another that have the same hash value. Well, in SHA-1, we have this 160-bit output, which means that we have, in principle, 2 raised to 160 possible outcomes of it. Okay, let's see how hard would it be to just test to create those. Well, if we could do 2 raised to 30 different possible outcomes each time we produce them, and we can do 2 raised to 34 of these per second, then we could do 2 raised to 89 per year, and it will only take 2 raised to 71 years to invert, to create all the different possible digesters and then find collisions. Well, that's quite a long time. But now we have something called the Birthdog paradox that makes it less hard. This is first the mathematical background for it. Say that we have a room with T people. Suppose each birthday is a random number taken from k days. That means 365, right? Because all have a birthday, one of the 365 days per year. That will give us k raised to t samples with the replacement. With replacement, we could have collisions. We could have several people having the same birthday. But the question is, how many possibilities are there for different combinations of all the different birthdays? Well, that would be k times k minus 1 plus times and all the way to k minus t plus 1. That are all the combination, all the possible combinations of birthdays in this population of T people. And what we're looking for now is, okay, how many of these are without any collision? Without any 2 people having the same birthday? Well, the probability of no repetition is, as you see, roughly 1 minus t times t minus 1 divided with 2k. And without going into the math too much, what we'll see is that the probability of repetition is in the order of t square. So the probability that there is a collision, that there are 2 people, is t square. What does that mean? Well, that means brute forcing a collision search is in the order of 2 raised to n divided with 2, not order 2 raised to n. So if you talk about the SHA, for instance, which have 160-bit digest, normally it would be 2 raised to 160 to find a collision. But this birthday paradox tells us that, well, it's just really 2 raised to 8 instead, which is not half, it's a huge amount less. Because if you go back to our figures here, we said that, well, maybe we can do 2 raised to 89 trials per year. That means we can find collisions here within a year easily. We don't have to spend 2 raised to 71 years to do it. Just as an example of this birthday paradox, we have here down here. In a group of people, how many are required to have a 50% chance that 2 people having the same birthday? That is really why it's called the birthday paradox. And as you see, the answer to that is it only requires about 23 people in a room for a 50% risk that 2 of them have the same birthday. We have 365 days to choose from, but it only takes 23 people in a room, so there is a 50% chance that there is a collision already. And that is why it's called the birthday paradox, and that is why it's so much easier to find collisions than we intuitively perhaps think. And as you see, if we move up to 60 people, it's almost 100% probability that we'll find a collision. So we don't have to find 365 people that may be the first idea to find a collision. It takes much less before we have a collision. So what we'll say with this is that collisions are more common than we think intuitively. That means it's actually easier to find them than we may first think. And that is why hash algorithms have to be much more complex and have larger digests than we perhaps think from the beginning. To add to this problem, in 2005, a Chinese cryptographer found that there is actually a vulnerability in this Merkle-Damgård construction that makes it, we don't need to do the 2 raised to 80 operations to find a collision. We can skip some of them. So it's only 2 raised to 63 operations that is actually it takes to find a collision. And again, that changes it quite a lot. It changes maybe, instead of taking a year, it only takes hours. So it reduces the complexity a lot. So SSH1 is really not secure enough. That's for sure now. What can we do? Well, we have these other hash algorithms in the family with longer digests. They have similar problems. They also have the birthday paradox problem. They also have this weakness. But since the digest is longer, they start from a better position. So that weakness is still not that problematic. It still means that it will take, if you go up to 256 and higher, it will still take many years to brute force find collisions. But finding such vulnerabilities and knowing that computing power is always increasing, it's not very satisfying to see that we have these limitations. So therefore, it was decided to build entirely new hash algorithm instead that didn't build on this Merkle-Damgård construction and didn't have that vulnerability at least. So similar to the AES competition, NIST put out a public request to make a new standard for hash algorithms. And let's see. Here we are, sorry. And here we are now in 2012 when this new winner had been decided. So again, it was a competition, lots of different suggestions, and testing and so on. And the one that won was called Ketchak. And that is now officially a standard. So that was in 2012, 6 years ago, when it was decided. Then it takes a number of years to incorporate that new standard into different other algorithms that uses hash algorithms before that is standardized. And then it takes time for products to use the new standards. So it is starting to be used now, but it's still not used everywhere. So it takes time to get a new standard out there. There are other hash algorithms as well. We start to mention this MD. That's an entire family of hash algorithms, and there are others as well. So we have a selection. It's not impossible to come up with a new hash algorithm. It's relatively easy. The same way as encryption algorithm, it's relatively easy to come up with a new one. It's much harder to prove that it actually is good enough, that it has the correct properties. But it's possible. Okay, so that's a hash algorithm. And hash algorithm takes some message, and we compute a hash digest or hash code from that. Well, what can we do with that? Well, one thing we could do with that is we have a sender and we have a receiver. We create a message here, and then we send that message over to the other side. Now we would like to know that the message made it without any problems. How can the receiver know that the message is okay? What do we in general do in order to check that nothing happened to a message?
Control sum.
Yeah, some type of control sum. And if you go back to networking, you've seen that we do different type of control sums at different levels. In the link layer or on the physical layer, link layer. Like Ethernet, we use a CRC code. If we use a modem connection, we may use parity bits. And we can use different checksums higher up in protocol stack. And so there are different ways to do that. A hash digest could also do this. We compute a digest and we add that. And once a message arrives, the receiver could just take the message part here and compute its own hash digest and then compare that it still is the same. And if there were any changes of a message, the probability that that would give the same hash digest is very small. That's what we've seen. We don't want collisions. So that an accidental change in the transmission should actually give us the same hash digest is extremely small. So a digest would be a good way to find these type of problems. Now, in networking, we already handle that with different checksums and so on. Now we're talking about security. And the problem we have now is not typically that there is a glitch in the network that changes some bits. The problem we have now is that we have an intruder, we have an adversary who is actively trying to attack us. So what happens if we have this intruder here who is now attacking us, stopping our message, changing it, and then forward the wrong message to us? Could we identify that? Yeah, we can do that. If I change the message, the hash wouldn't match. But our intruder is smarter than that.
You can change the hash.
Exactly. The intruder knows what hash algorithm we're using. So what he's doing is changing the message, and then he just recalculates a new hash and replaces the hash that we had, and then forward the new message with a new hash. So when we get it, we test it by recalculating the hash and match, and it matches. So we don't see that someone changed the message. This is where keyed hash functions come in. So a keyed hash function is based on a hash algorithm, but we also include a key in the scheme here, a secret key that makes it impossible for an intruder to calculate a new fake message with a fake hash algorithm that we wouldn't find out about. The original idea of that is very simple, as you see here. We calculate a keyed hash from just taking a hash of the message and just we append a key, a secret message before the message, and then we send it. And then we just send the message part, of course. And then on the side, the receiver just adds the message again and calculates the hash based on both the key and message. If now the intruder would change the message on the way, he couldn't calculate the hash, because he doesn't have a key. So this is the idea. This simple scheme, there were some weaknesses found it, so we couldn't just do that, because there are some attacks, like if we send very, very small messages. Eventually we could force them to send so small messages that they only send the key, and then the key could be found out. So it wasn't good enough. So instead it was a new standard developed again, which is called HMAC, which is based on the same idea that we have a key and we have a normal hash function, and now we try to make it work without the weaknesses. So the HMAC is that we should be able to use any hash function, and we should just embed the hash algorithm of hash function into our HMAC framework. And we shouldn't change the properties of that hash function. If it's a sure hash function, it should still be that. We want to include a key in some way, and that's what we'll do. And it looks like this. So it's a little bit more complex than the simple scheme, but still it's quite easy actually. We have to calculate this HMAC value based on a message by doing a few more hash calculation. And we include a key, but not in just a one step, but in two different steps. We can look at it in the figure here. We start with K plus, which is our key. It's a simple key. It's just a short key of some sort. We XOR that key with two different bit patterns. These are actually defined by the standard. What we're saying is that in the first step, we're using some bits of a key, and in the second step, we're using another set of bits. So it's just that we are taking different parts of a key. In the first step, we add that to the first block of our message, and then we have the rest of our message. We compute the normal hash of all the things together with that part of the key, creating intermediate value. That will be our new message, and then we include our key again in a block, and we compute hash again. But this will be a very small message that you compute hash on, so it will be very fast. So the only thing that we need to do extra, we already calculated the hash for these normally. Now we have to add this block here and this block here, so it will be two more hash repetitions, but on very small. So it will be, the overhead will be extremely small compared to just make the normal hash. So the cost is very small here. So how good it is? Well, it's actually proved that the security of this HMAC is related directly to how secure the hash algorithm we're using is. And we can try to attack it with brute force. The birthday attack is in play, but if we just use an hash algorithm with enough size of a digest, that's not a problem. So yeah, it's working, and it's working well. The only problem that we really have here is with the key here, because we have the same problem with this key as we have with keys for encryption. Both sender and receiver need to have this key. And how can we distribute that key to the other side in a secure way? That is the main problem here. Otherwise, it works very well. Okay, perfect time for a break before we start looking at encryption instead.
Okej, så är jag sigurare.
You know, older people. Older people.
Да, и видите, импульсы на classification, like this my budget to us.
Which is not big. Should it which number increases number which number which opposite from the
De fapt, dacă te uiți pe Ladoc, noi nu avem niciun examen
la ce asta?
la cursurile astea două. Adică la celelalte examination, el aici s-ar putea să fie examen. De fapt, nu e nimic trecut. Un examen to register.
Serios?
Da.
Da, avem examen acolo.
Și dacă mi-aduc bine aminte, atunci Max îmi zicea că ei n-au niciun examen. El n-avea niciun examen. Nu era activ.
Da, atunci de ce?
Unde zici tu examen?
Hai să
Da, nu
și tu
nimic
la
de
examenul ăla, câte puncte? Oh my god.
O să faci pauză asta?
Cred că trebuie să ai un probabil. Dar o să încerc să scriu. Da? Snarare copy paste of the scheme. He's one of the good.
Okay. So, if we go back to what we talked about yesterday, it was private key encryption. So this is just one slide about that again. In private key or secret key or symmetric encryption scheme, we use one key. We use the same key for encryption and decryption. So that's a basic thing. And then we know we had this problem then of key distribution, how to get that key to the other side. That is really the main problem. So now we'll introduce public key encryption then, which is a relatively new idea then. Encryption has been used for thousands of years, but public key encryption is only about 50 years old. We didn't have anything like that before. So it's a quite recent invention. So now we have two keys in most of the cases when we talk about public key. And then we have one that's called the public key and one that is the private key. So now we have two different keys and they have different properties. The idea with public key encryption is not to replace normal encryption, but to complement, because there are some limitations with public key encryption. One of the main problems with it is that it's much slower than symmetric encryption, which means that if you want to encrypt large amount of text, it's not very efficient. So when we have to do that, we have to resort back to normal symmetric encryption. But then we can combine them in different ways, and that's typically how we do it. Another limitation is that we don't have that many methods. It's much harder to come up with a new algorithm for public key encryption. It requires us to come up with some new mathematical concept that have very certain properties, and that is not something that we can easily do. There is only a few examples of methods that we can base this on, compared to normal encryption, where we can easily come up with any number of different algorithms. Why do we use public key encryption? Well, there are two main ideas that it was developed for. The first is this key distribution problem. We want to get away with this problem of having to distribute the key to the other side, and how to do that in a secure way, because it is very hard to do that. We will look at the end a little bit on how we can handle key distribution also for symmetric encryption schemes, but it may involve what we see here on the slide, a KDC, a key distribution center. And that means we have to have trust in someone else to handle the keys for us, which is a limitation. So key distribution is one idea. The second is digital signatures. And that comes back to the non-repudiation that we talked about in the first lecture. That we can prove that someone have been doing something, and we can do that with digital signature. We have to sign the document, and by signing it digitally, we link it to a certain person, and then it can be a legal signature, a trusted signature. I see it based on invention by two researchers, Diffie and Hellman, and that's why one of his methods is called the Diffie-Hellman method. This is the first published result in 1976. But there had been going on work for a number of years before it was published, and there were other methods that were developed before the Diffie-Hellman, but they were never published. And there was some secret work done by secret agencies and so on, maybe 10 years earlier. So it was in the air that this should come, but it was in 76 it was actually published one. So now we have these two keys then, the public key, and it's called a public key because anyone can know about it. It doesn't have to be a secret key, it doesn't have to be private. It's actually a good idea to distribute as much as possible. So anyone should know it. And then the other key, the private key, and that key should really be private. We should never let anyone else except ourselves know about that key. The only way to have digital signatures working is that we actually keep that very private, for instance. So we have the two keys. Of course, there must be a relation between those two keys, because the idea is that we can encrypt one of the keys, and then we can decrypt the message with other keys. So there has to be a relation between them. But that relation should be impossible to determine by just looking at one of the keys. We shouldn't be able to, okay, this is a key. What is the other key in this key pair? We shouldn't be able to calculate that, because then it will fall apart. The scheme then for encryption have almost the same ingredients as for normal encryption. We have a plain text, we have an encryption algorithm, but now we have two keys, one private and one public. We have a decryption algorithm, and we produce a ciphertext. So the only difference here is that we know that we have two keys now. So then it looks like this. We start to the left with the plain text. We have an encryption algorithm to produce a ciphertext. To decrypt the ciphertext, we use a key again to get the plain text. It's very, very similar. There are some changes now here. First, we see that to the left here, we talk about not just a key, but we talk about a key ring. Because think about this situation, we would like to communicate with different people. And for each one we communicate with, we need to have separate keys. So what we do is we gather public keys from everyone we would like to communicate. So in this case here, we are communicating with Alice. That means if we want to send a message to Alice, we need to have Alice's public key, together with all the other public keys that we have gathered. So they are in our key ring. Now when we produce that message, we look at the recipient of the message, we say, okay, it's Alice, and then we select Alice's public key to encrypt. And then we transfer it, and when it reaches Alice, Alice can use her private key to decrypt it. So let's look at this situation for a little while. if now someone captures that message while it's being transferred, this encrypted message, who could decrypt it? What is needed to decrypt it? We need Alice's private key. That's the only way to decrypt the message. And as long as Alice is doing the correct thing, not disclosing her key, she is the only one who could actually decrypt it. Who could produce that message? Anyone, yeah, anyone can produce it. Anyone who have access to Alice's public key. And Alice's public key should be publicly known, so anyone can have it. So when Alice receives this message, she has no idea where it comes from. Anyone can have produced it. But she is the only one who can decrypt it. Okay, let's turn it around a little bit. Here we have a plain text. Now we start to encrypt it using Bob's private key. Okay, and then it's transmitted on the network. Okay, say an intruder now captures this message. Who can decrypt it?
Anybody who has Bob's public key.
Yeah, anyone who has Bob's public key. And as before, a public key should be public, which means that anyone can have it. So in this case, anyone can decipher it, which means that we don't have any confidentiality here. We have lost that. Anyone can read the message. We know it came from Bob, exactly. That's the point here. Instead of having confidentiality, we now have sender authentication. We know that it had to be Bob who created it, because we are able to decrypt it using Bob's public key. That means it had to be Bob's private key that created it. So it must come from whoever owns Bob's private key. We'll come back to this a little bit later. If we look at in general now how we can use this public key crypto system, there are now 3 different application areas for it. We can use it for encryption decryption, like symmetric encryption, but as I said before, it's much slower, so it's not very efficient, but we can use it for that. We can use it for digital signature. In the previous example, when Bob encrypted that message using his private key, in some way he signed the document. We will do it a little bit different later on, but the idea is based on that we use our private key to encrypt something, and then we can link it back to that person. So that is the signature. But we can also use it for key exchange, meaning that we can exchange keys that we can then later on use with conventional encryption algorithms, which are fast. So we can solve this problem we have with conventional encryption key distribution. But first, let's look at the properties that any of these methods need to have. And again, we have 6 different properties. The first one says that it should be computationally easy for party B to generate a key pair, a public key, private key pair. That means it should be easy to create a key pair where these keys are locked to each other, but as I said before, it's not obvious how they are related to each other. Secondly, it should be easy to encrypt something using this key. It should be an algorithm that we can easily implement and follow. The third one says that, okay, if we receive an encrypted message, we should easily be able to decrypt it if we just have a correct key. So far, it's quite obvious. Then we put in the hard conditions here. Again, computationally infeasible to determine the private key known on the public key. That's what I said before. If we just receive the public key, we shouldn't be able to calculate what is the private key of that pair. If we could do that, it wouldn't work. And number 5, computationally feasible to recover a message knowing the public key and the ciphertext. Obviously, we need the private key to decipher it. So we shouldn't be able to decrypt something unless we have a correct key. And then number 6 is not mandatory. It depends on how we would like to use the algorithm. But it says that either of the 2 keys can be used for encryption with other use for decryption. And that says that we can turn it around. We can either start with a private key and then decrypt with a public key, or we can start with a public key and then decrypt with a private key instead. If we can choose the way here, then we can use it for more areas. But it's different for different algorithms if we can do this or not. So there are 2 main algorithms that we look at, and then we mention a few more that exist. But these are the 2 main ones, the RSA and the Diffie-Hellman. RSA, as you see, was published a year later than Diffie-Hellman. And it's, for a long time, RSA was the main algorithm that was used when we talk about public key encryption. And then we have Diffie-Hellman, and Diffie-Hellman is also quite widely used, but it's only used for certain applications. It couldn't be used to encrypt text, but it can be used for key exchange, so it's more limited. But in that typical application area, Diffie-Hellman is very efficient. Oops. So let's look at them a little bit. Here we have the RSA algorithm to create keys. We said that the first requirement was that we can create a key pair, and this is how to create a key pair using the RSA. We start with number 1 here. Select 2 numbers. They should both be prime numbers. And this is one of the reasons for why there is always a hunt going on to find big prime numbers. You've probably seen it sometimes on the news saying that, yes, now they have found even higher prime numbers. So they're always looking. But there are unlimited number of prime numbers, but we don't know them all. So we're always searching for them, and it's computationally quite hard to do that, especially when it gets big. So that is always a hunt to find these very, very big prime numbers. And this is one of the reasons for why we want to find them. Okay, second step. It's not hard to find prime numbers. There are lots of prime numbers. Could you mention a prime number? 13, yeah. And why is that a prime number?
Yeah, because it's only divisible by itself.
Yeah, it doesn't have any factors. We couldn't divide it up. Like 6 is 2 times 3, which means that 6 is not a prime number. But 13 is. We couldn't split it up in factors like that. Right, so there are lots of prime numbers actually. Then we calculate this n, which is just the product of these 2 prime numbers. That's easy. Step number 3, calculate this phi of n, which is, as you see, p minus 1 times q minus 1. Again, easy. We just take the prime number minus 1, both of them, and then we multiply them together. Okay. Then it's get a little bit harder, because now we say that select an integer e here that has this property that first e is, as you see, between 1 and this 5n that we calculated before. But then the greatest common division between this phi of n and e is 1, which means that they are what we call relative prime to each other. They don't have any common factors. Again, with this phi of n, there are lots of numbers that have this property. And what we typically do is we randomly choose a number and then we test if it has this property or not. And if it fails, We just draw another number. And since prime numbers are relatively common, we don't have to test too many numbers before we find one. We could try to use smarter methods that can give us a number with that property immediately as well, but it's typically not needed. So okay, we select one of many possible ones. But there are of course lots of numbers that are not possible here as well within this range here. It has to have this property. Once we have selected that, we make a calculation here, as you see in number 5. We take e raised to minus 1 mod 5n, and that will give us a number d. It's just to do that calculation, nothing strange with that at all. Now we have a e and we have a d, and we have this n that we calculated up here in step 2. Now we have all the things needed to build our keys. So the public key is just e and n, and the private key is just d and n. It's maybe not obvious why this actually works and why just selecting e and showing that to everyone that we couldn't easily calculate d for ourselves. But the idea is that we don't know n because we don't know the p and q that was used. And that's why just knowing e doesn't mean that we can easily calculate d ourselves, because we don't have the intruder or the the bad guy wouldn't have enough information to do that. So he would have to start the test. And if p and q are big prime numbers, the space here, the test space, is huge. So he has to run lots of tests. So it would be the same as a brute force attack, really. And it would take too long time if p and q is just big enough. So that's the key generation algorithm, and that is at the core of the RSA algorithm. Then the question is, how do we encrypt and decrypt? And again, this is not obvious. This is something that some of you will take the course, or maybe you took it already, the cryptography course, the math course. But this is the encryption. We take a plain message n, but it has to be smaller than the n that we had in the previous slide. So it's a limitation for how big messages we can encrypt, actually. And then we take just this m raised to e mod n. E and n were the private key. So it's just this mathematical computation, m raised to e mod n. That's the entire encryption. The decryption is equally simple. We take just the ciphertext raised to d, which is the public key, mod n, and we get m back. I have an example here showing that. We have, I don't show the calculations of the key, but we have created a key pair based on that n SSC 187. We have selected 7 that is within that range, and then we calculate that 23 is the matching pair to that, using these calculations that we have here. So I've done that already. If you look at this, 187 is n, which means that the prime numbers we have used are very small, around 10, something like that, in the size of that. So this is an extremely small example compared to what we use in reality. But it's just to show how it works. The encryption then, well, we have a plain text here. This is our message. It's 88. It's smaller than 187, so it should be okay. We take 88 raised to 7, mod 187, and that will be 11. So 11 is our ciphertext. To decrypt it, we take 11 raised to 23, the other part of the key, again mod 197, and we get 88 back. So, well, this just shows that it works in this example. I don't expect that you will take this as a proof that it actually always works, but it does. Now, this may seem relatively simple, but what makes this a little bit hard computationally is that when we actually use this in reality, we have big prime numbers, as I said before. What happens if we have big prime numbers then? Well, then these numbers here are quite big, the keys. Think about now that we take a message that may be millions, billions, something like that. It's a big message. Of course, it's a huge number. We raise it to another huge number. What do we have? A really, really huge number. And that type of numbers, a computer couldn't compute normally with the built-in computational functions that we have. We would have to handle that by software to do the computation. And that's quite slow. These big numbers we couldn't do normal computations on, and that's why it's slow. The Diffie-Hellman is the second algorithm that is mostly used on, and that is used for key exchange then. As you see, this is the flow. We start with, again, Alice and Bob. They share, as you see, a prime Q and a number such that that number is smaller than Q. And it's, well, it has some properties, but they share some initial information. That is just to set up and say, okay, we would like to create a key pair within these boundaries. So they have to share that first. Then, both of them create a random private part that no one knows about. So they just create a random number. Based on that number, they do a calculation. So see, we create XA here, and then we create something called YA, which is this alpha up here raised to XA mod Q. So it's quite similar to the calculations that we do in RSA. But we calculate this Y of A, which is based on our secret value. On the other side, Bob is doing the same thing. He selects his own number, XB. No one knows about this XB. He calculates this YB based on this XB. And then we exchange the information. We send YB in one direction, Y of A in the other direction. So now both parties have their own secret information, and they have an information from the other side. An intruder would know Y of B and Y of A, because we can wiretap, we can listen to the traffic, and we get those two. Knowing both these wouldn't help. We wouldn't be able to deduce anything using that. But if we have one of these hidden, X of A or X of B, together with the other Y, we can calculate a value. And that value is a shared key. We don't know what that value will be. It's just a random value. But calculation on both sides will result in the same value. And no one else can make that calculation because no one else have either X of A or X of B. So what we have done is that we haven't sent any information because we couldn't say that I want to send this information and use the Diffie-Hellman. But what we have done is that we have created a secret value on both sides that is the same. And that can be used now as a key to encrypt using symmetric encryption method. So now we have handled this key distribution problem using Diffie-Hellman. There are some attacks against Diffie-Hellman, and this is one of them, the man in the middle attack. Here we have Darth. I'm not sure if it's Darth Vader or but he's Darth at least. And he sits between Alice and Bob. When Alice sends something to Bob, Darth is in the middle and can intercept that message. So Alice creates her secret value and calculates this public value and sends it. She thinks it sends it to Bob, but actually Darth is taking it. Based on that, Darth makes his own calculation and sends back to Alice. Now Alice thinks she is talking to Bob, but in reality she is talking to Darth. What we have done now is that we have created a secret key pair between Alice and Darth, but Alice thinks she had done it with Bob. Now Darth is doing the same thing with Bob. Intercepts a message here, creates a secret key between Darth and Bob. And now when Alice starts to send messages here encrypted with secret value, again Darth intercepts it, can decrypt it with his key, and then encrypts it again with the other key that he had created with Bob. So the effect is that we create the message, we encrypt it, it will be decrypted in Darth. Darth can intercept, he can change, he can do whatever he wants with it. He encrypts it again with a new key, forwards it to Bob, and Bob thinks, of course, that it has been encrypted all the way from Alice to Bob. We don't see that someone else has been here in the middle. So this is the man-in-the-middle attack, and the basic Diffie-Hellman couldn't protect against that type of attack, which is of course severe. But there are additions to Diffie-Hellman to make it work. What we need to do is we need to be able to authenticate the two parties so we see that it's the correct party we're talking to and not this Darth here. So there are ways to handle it. There are some other public key encryption algorithms. We have one called digital signature standard. It's based on mainly hash algorithm, and it's used for just digital signatures. That's the only thing it's used for actually. Then we have the elliptic curve, the ECC, which is based on an entirely different type of math compared to the RSA, but it has the same application, and it can be used for anything. It can be used for encryption, it can be used for digital signatures, and it can be used for key exchange. So it's very versatile, the same as RSA. And it's gaining more and more use. RSA is being replaced more and more by this ECC. So it seems to be actually a good replacement. RSA is still used, but ECC is used more and more. And then we have this LGAML, which is actually a variation of Diffie-Hellman, which makes it possible to use it as an encryption algorithm, that we can encrypt the information instead of just having key exchange. But it's based entirely on Diffie-Hellman. So there are a few that we can select from, but these are typically what we have. We don't have tens or hundreds of different. These are the ones. But research is of course always looking for other mathematical ideas on how to build other types of public encryption. So there will probably emerge some other. A word about key lengths. We didn't talk about that for the the public keys, but typically key length is much longer. As you see here, we talk about key lengths about 2,000 up to 8,000 bits for public encryption. While, as you've seen before, the conventional encryption is much smaller, up to 256 bits perhaps. The reason for why keys has to be much longer is because for conventional encryption, we can choose any key. All keys are possible. So in the space of possible keys, all points are possible to choose. In public key encryption, not all points in the space are possible. Only some are possible, so it's much more sparse. So even if we have 8,000 bits for them. We don't have so many possible keys as there are for conventional encryption, and that's why it needs to be much bigger. Bigger keys are more cumbersome to use and makes it slower, and the mathematics itself in public key is slower, and that's why it's altogether slower. Actually, if we look at all the three different types of arguments talked about now, we have hashing, we have symmetric encryption, and we have public encryption. And they are more or less related, so that hashing is perhaps 10 times faster than conventional encryption, and conventional encryption is about 10 times faster than public key encryption. So if we can choose, we always would like to use the hash function first. If that is not enough, we want to use the symmetric encryption. If that is not enough, then we use public key encryption, if speed is something that matters. And in most cases, it does matter. Now, move over to authentication. What is authentication? Well, we would like to know that the message comes from someone. We claim a message comes from a certain person, and I would like to be able to see that that is actually true. Another type of authentication is that the message is not changed. So that is called, the first one is sender authentication, the second one is message authentication, but the message is okay, it hasn't been changed. And sometimes we could also would like to have a third option here, that it's the message is correct in time. That can make a matter if we want to stop what's called a replay attack. Someone captures a message, keeps it for a while, and then releases a copy of it. And if we couldn't see that it's an old copy, then it may be doing things that we don't want to. So we might want to be able to know that, yes, this is sent in the correct time. So that's authentication in general. How can we implement authentication? Well, we want to create what's called a message authentication tag, or add that to our message. Just like I draw before, that we have a message and we have our hash code. But we said that the hash code is not enough. We need to include a key somehow to make it into a message authentication. So that's different ideas of doing that. We can base it on different ideas. We can use conventional encryption. If we encrypt an entire message using conventional encryption, and on the other side we decrypt it, then of course we know that it hasn't been changed on the way, unless the key has been compromised. But as long as the key is not compromised, only the sender and receiver have a key, no one else could have changed that message. So we have message authentication, but we don't have any sender authentication, because we don't know who created it. Both sides have the same key. It could be either side who created the message. We couldn't prove who it was. If a message authentication without encryption, well, then we generate and append this authentication tag, and let's look at these different ideas to do that. Here we start with a message on the left. We have what we call a message authentication algorithm. We add a secret value K to that to create a message authentication code. So a message authentication code is sort of a hash together with a key that we can append. And then on the other side we can check. As long as K is secret, only sender and receiver knows about it, this should work. Exactly as the example we had before. But the question is how we compute it. So here we have some options of doing that. The first example up here says that we take the message, we take a hash code of it, can be any hash algorithm, and then we encrypt that hash algorithm using conventional encryption. And that will be our message authentication code. So what is needed on the other side then is that we do the same. We compute the hash for the message. We extract the message authentication code for message, decrypt it using the secret key that we have shared, and then we compare. So that's one way to do it. But this has the limitation, as I said before, that we have the same key on both sides. We don't know if it was the sender or receiver who actually created the message. Doing the same thing, but with public key encryption down here, looks very similar. We take the message, we create a hash code, we encrypt it. Now we use our private key and the public encryption scheme instead to create a message authentication code. On the other side, we extract the MAC code, we decrypt it with our public key, with the public key of the sender, and then we compare. And now we know both that message is okay, but we also know that it actually had to come from a certain person, one owning this private key. So we have also sender authentication, not only message authentication. And how much work do we need to do here? Well, the message can be huge, of course, but the main operation we do is hashing, and we said hashing is very fast. So, and the only thing we encrypt is the hash digest. And we said the hash digest is 160 up to 512 bits. It's a very, very small message. Encrypting that doesn't take very long time. So it should be efficient. This is the idea that we started out actually with, that we just include a secret value up here. Then we perform a hash on that. And on the other side we have to include, we said that that wasn't very good. It was not a secure method, and also it doesn't give us any sender authentication. So it's a simple one, but it's not very good. Now we have one big problem left that we need to handle. If we go back here to the picture down here. Down here, we encrypt something with a private key, and we use the public key to decrypt it. What do we really know about the sender? Do we know who the sender is? Not really, actually. The only thing we know is that the sender have access to this private key. But who is the sender? Well, I could create a key pair, and then I publish the public part of that key pair on internet, on different key servers and I claim to be the Prime Minister of France. Okay. And now I send a message using the private key in that key pair to a newspaper. And the newspaper receives that. And to decrypt it, they need to use the public key. So they go to the key server. And the key server says, yes, this is the public key of the Prime Minister of France. But that's just me saying that I am that. There's no proof of it. Anyone can create a key pair and claiming to be anyone when we publish that key. So there's really no link between the key and the person. So that is missing. The only thing we know is that that key was used. We don't know who owns it, who has access to it. So we need to be able to know that somehow. Okay, I got a question here on the chat. How can we receive and know that the message content received has not been altered? Well, in all of these cases that we have here, we are using a hash algorithm to create the digest based on the message. If on any of these methods, the message part here would change during transmission. Then the hash, the message authentication code wouldn't match with it because we are testing the message when it arrives with the hash algorithm again. So changing just the message part would be easy to detect in either of these methods. But the question back then, how can we link the key to a person? Well, to do that we use something called a public key certificate. We'll look at that next week more in detail. But the idea is that we have some information here about a person. So this is a document describing a person and a public key that that person have. We hash that. That means we lock that information together. We couldn't change just the name or change the public key because now we're working with a hash of it. That hash is encrypted with a key. And that is a private key that is encrypted with to create a message authentication code, we can say, and that is added to this information about this person. This creates a document now. That document says there is a relation between this person and this key, and there is a signature down here that vouches for that, saying, yes, that is correct. This person and this key are linked together. How can we test that? Well, we can test it by doing the same thing. We do a hash here. That will give us a hash value. And then we can decrypt that hash value with the public, because it was signed by a private key. That means there is a public key that we can find, so we can extract that, and we can compare to see that the information in the certificate is correct. The one thing that we still need to think about is, okay, who is vouching for this? Who is owning this private key and who is signing it, and how does that work? Well, that is a certain organization called a certificate authority who is doing that. So they are having that work, they are checking. When anyone wants to create a certificate, they would have to prove somehow that yes, they are that person, they have this key, they own it, and once the certificate authority is convinced that that is correct, they are linked together, then he would sign it. And as long as we have trust in the certificate authority, then we have trust in the certificate, and then we can know that a certain key is actually linked to a certain person. So now when we receive a message from someone and we can decrypt it with a public key, we can know who the person was behind that private key, as long as there is a certificate that links them together. And it's quite interesting to see that to create this certificate, we're using hash algorithms and we're using public key encryption scheme. So we're using the same tools that we protect with the tools that we are using to protect them. So they are really linked together. Okay, one last slide. Just to mention that there is much more to encryption than we are talking about in this course. We have something called homomorphic encryption. Homomorphic encryption is a certain type of encryption where we encrypt data in a certain way, and then we can do computation on it in encrypted form without having to decrypt it. We can make searches, if we put this in a database, we can run different database queries and, for instance, calculate the mean average or income of all the people, but still all the information is encrypted, so we couldn't read the information itself. So that's a nice way to be able to have information very secure, very private, and still be able to use it for different types of computations. There are some methods of doing this. It's quite complicated, and there are some limitations to it, but it's an area that is researched quite a lot on. And for privacy, it's very interesting. So that's something you can know about. And then we have a quantum encryption that I talked about before. And there are different fields of quantum encryption. The most successful so far is key exchange, I think, using quantum methods. That makes it possible to exchange keys and prove that no one could have been able to see that key. Because part of a quantum of encryption is that whenever you observe some information, it is changed. So if you send something to the other side, well, the receiver would change it, but we would know it. But if someone else observes that information, it will be changed. Then we can immediately see at destination that it has been observed by someone else. So that is an idea how to make key exchange and also encrypt data in a way that it's impossible to actually observe it from anyone else. But there are also ideas about how we can use quantum encryption to attack normal encryption, because we can. A problem with normal encryption when we try to do cryptanalysis or decrypt is that we have to test one value at a time, and it takes a long time, especially when we increase the key sizes. With quantum encryption, in theory, we have a possibility to test all combinations at once. It doesn't matter if we have 1,000 bits of key. We can test all of them in one go. So it could be extremely fast to decrypt. This doesn't work in practice yet, and hopefully it will not in recent years, because that will ruin all the normal encryption that we have today. But there is work going on, and it may happen in the future. So that is something to keep an eye out for if you work in security, that what happens with quantum encryption. Okay, any questions before we stop for today? Now this week has been about basics, basic about security and basic about the tools. Next week we'll start to look at actual standards and products using these standards. So it will be more related to what we actually do and can use. And next week you will have a first introduction, a first assignment. I haven't scheduled it yet, but it will be, I don't remember if it will be Tuesday or Friday late afternoon. But it will come in the schedule later today. Okay, any questions online? Okay. Well, have a nice week and then see you next week.